UPSC. I'm a grad program director of the PhD in higher education and also program coordinator of the master's degree in college student affairs. Dr. Sandra Tomlinson-Clark and I are co-chairing this search, and I'm just delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Garcia to you. And I'm also pleased that so many students came. Thank you very much. Dr. Garcia earned her PhD from UCLA years ago. She's in the second year of postdoctoral work at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's going to talk to us today about reconstructing deficit discourses of Latinx, Latino students in higher education. So please help me welcome Dr. Garcia.
I'm going to stand here because I'm obviously really short, so I want to be able to engage with you all. So as Flo was saying, thank you for having me here. It's a great opportunity to share my work with you. So as she was saying, I am a postdoc currently at Penn in the higher education division, and it's a delight to be here. The title of my talk today is Reconstructing Deficit Discourses of Latinx Students in Higher Education. Latinx is a term in which has kind of newly emerged within the community, and it's a way to acknowledge those that are not gender conforming, and so they choose to take the X whether because they don't identify with the A or the O. Within my presentation, I'll definitely interchange between Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, and if you have questions at the end, please feel free to ask me. So I'm going to start a little bit by explaining who I am and how I come to my research. You see, throughout the presentation, I'll have artwork. I think it's a great way to bring in the communities that I come from at various different locations. So this one is actually from Salt Lake City, Utah. That's where I was born and raised, and so it's a mural that was done by one of my undergraduate participants when I was doing research at that time. So I felt it was really important to bring here with you all. So to start, Creswell asserts that researchers need to acknowledge their own power, engage in dialogues, and use theory to interpret or illuminate social actions. So a researcher's positionality is important to acknowledge when conducting any type of study, and more importantly, theory acts as a lens to interpret and understand the world around us. So for me specifically, I engage in what Dolores Delgado Bernal called the Chicana feminist epistemology. So as a Chicano Puerto Rican being born and raised in Salt Lake City, Utah, and being trained in the social sciences, I bring that with me. So she explains that a Chicano feminist epistemology really challenges Western knowledges and kind of the dichotomies of male versus female, and really asserts that the subjective knowledge that one brings into the research process is seen as an asset. And so I definitely believe in that, and I definitely use that within my work, and it allows me to understand the community of interest and various sensitivities when I enter a community that I study. So in order to do that, and in terms of reconstructing deficit discourses, what I mean by deficit discourses is that traditionally a lot of communities of color have, whether they're succeeding in the educational pipeline or failing, a lot of attributions result in them not being successful within the family, right? And lots of placing the blame on. For me, I don't see that as true. I see that they bring assets to institutions of education, and the ways that I reveal that is through the theoretical frameworks I engage in. So specifically, I talk about semiotics. So if anyone knows what semiotics is, it's the study of sign systems, and for instance, we have a common sign system language here, right? So depending on the type of language you speak, we have agreed upon the meaning of it. So for instance, I used Latinx earlier. Before, it used to be Latino, Latina, and then as we all know, identity is fluid and it changes. So currently we're seeing this movement of Latinx. So we call that a semiotic shift, meaning that discourse is changing in the ways in which we study specific population changes. Another theoretical framework that I engage in is US third world feminism. This is countering the 1960s movement in which white women emerged and were very interested in equal pay and equal advancement into jobs. However, women of color were saying, we've been here, we've been doing this for centuries, and we want to be recognized, and that the women of color experience needs to be heard. And so they came, Black feminists, Chicano feminists, and other groups came together to talk about this US third world feminism movement. And last, I engage in critical race theory in education. This basically asserts that racism and race permeate educational institutions, and that educational institutions were not necessarily designed for people of color or communities of color in mind, yet they still thrive and succeed within them. And so how do we do that in particular? All of these, for me, act as countering deficit perspectives. Again, these are just a few of the theories. We could talk about theory all day, but these are the ones that I'm going to use to counter deficit perspectives today. So in reconstructing deficit discourse to asset-based in higher education, I do this through 3 ways. One is through students. I recenter students as knowledge holders and their abilities to give name to their own experiences. So I really ask, what assets do students bring from their homes and communities to assist them in persisting through graduation? Methodology is really important, right? So method generally only refers to techniques and strategies for collecting data, whereas methodology provides both theory and analysis of the research process and how research questions are framed and the criteria used to evaluate research findings. So coupling with critical theories, we can really reveal a lot through the methods. Lastly, I look at institutions. Specifically, I ask, how do students' social identities act as a guiding marker to understand four-year institutions and the various types? So how are students perceiving the institutions they experience, and is it exactly, if an institution has a mission, is it meeting the students' needs, and are they experiencing it in that way? So my demographic, my population of interest is Latinx in the US. And so I'm going to talk about the demographic context of who they are in the United States. So within the US population, we see that here Hispanic, then this is a term used by the American Community Survey, but Latinx are the largest ethnic minority in the United States. When we disaggregate Hispanic, which isn't often done and should be done because we need to understand the variation within the population, we can see that Mexican and Puerto Ricans make up the highest proportions within group. Mexican and Puerto Ricans also have a very long-standing history with the United States and the ways in which they have become U.S. citizens or not. So with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 for Mexicans at that time, that allowed them to become Mexican Americans, and that's what we got on the Southwest, so California, Texas, Arizona, and so forth. And Puerto Ricans, with the Jones Act in 1917, automatically made them U.S. citizens without them really wanting to become citizens. So we have to remember that history when we look at educational institutions. So me specifically, I really want to understand who these people are within the context of higher education. Are we getting to college, and if so, what do the numbers look like in terms of gaining a bachelor's degree or above? So right here you see I use Chicana and Chicano instead of Mexican American. This is strategic because in the Southwest in the 1960s there was the Chicano movement in which the community walked out of schools and demanded the rights to have access into higher education and also have their experiences reflected in the curriculum. So it's about a political consciousness and also about identifying as a Mexican American. It's twofold. Not every Mexican American identifies as a Chicana or Chicano and vice versa, but for the purpose of the study, I use it. Puerto Ricans, again, we're seeing a lot going on in Puerto Rico as it is today, so this is completely fluid and going to change. In terms of bachelor degree attainment, we can see that, well, Latinx are the largest ethnic minority that you saw previously in the United States. They have the lowest attainment rates in terms of bachelor degree attainment. So if we're the largest ethnic minority group moving forward and we're the future of the U.S., it's kind of startling to see these numbers, right, that they're really low. So what's going on? When we disaggregate, which needs to happen, we can see that Mexican and Puerto Ricans have the lowest completion rates. Mexicans, have the lowest completion rates, and the Puerto Rican have the fourth lowest completion rates. So that's really startling to see, and we know very little about the diverse experiences within group. So a lot of the higher ed literature focuses on Mexican American and Chicano experiences, which is not bad. We need to know more, but we also know that Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Dominicans have a long-standing history in the U.S. as well, and we should learn more about them. And very few studies are comparative to account for the heterogeneity experiences of the Latinx population. So research often focuses a lot on the reasons why these populations fell and not the reasons why they succeed. And that's kind of where my intervention comes in. So what is it? Failure is important to examine, absolutely, but what are we doing to succeed that maybe educational institutions are not recognizing? And so this is a study that I conducted for my dissertation to explain a little bit about the title, Adelante y Pa'lante, Chicano O and Puerto Rican college-educated families. So Spanish is the common language that we have among the Puerto Rican and Chicano community, but the ways in which we use it are different. So Adelante within the 1960s Chicano movement meant always moving forward, and Pa'lante within the Puerto Rican community means the same thing, but it's a play on words, right? So it's very interesting to see the different types of use of Spanish. Here you have a mural that's in East Harlem in New York, which I took, which I thought was beautiful to capture my study itself. But here you have Frida Kahlo, who was a Mexican revolutionary, and then Julia de Burgos, who is also a poet, and I would see as a revolutionary as well. And they're holding hands. They have similar struggles within the U.S., but they're very different, and this is what my study reveals. Specifically, I choose to use college-educated because Pascarilla and Terrazzini have argued that completing a bachelor's degree will increase the likelihood of securing a well-paying and satisfying job, not only for the college student, but his or her children. However, it's very color mute, so we don't know what this looks like for other racial and ethnic minority groups. So within the actual higher education literature, we know a lot about first-generation college students, and we have a common definition of what that means, so your parents did not attend a four-year institution. But when it comes to the other, so those students that have college-educated parents or one, there seems to be a contention in regards to nomenclature. So Terrazzini in 1994 named this population traditional college student. Pike and Q in 2005 named this population second. Paulson in 2005 named them continuing college student. And then Romo Sanchez and Nichols in 2007 named them non-first generation college student. So just to add the complexities, I chose to name this population college educated, but I really wanted to get away in terms of generation, because when we think about Latinos, we think about immigration to U.S. citizenship status and generation. For me, I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned about if the parent is college educated and the child is college educated. So that's the reason why I chose that. This study was funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation within Latino studies in particular, so I feel like it had a really great contribution to what we know about Latinos in the U.S. So my research questions are twofold. I apologize for if you can't see them. So the first one is, how do Puerto Rican and Chicano O college educated families understand their pathways to and through institutions of higher education? And two, in what ways do their knowledge bases contribute to assisting institutions of higher education and meeting the needs of Latinx students? So the theoretical frameworks that I used for this study were critical race theory in education. As I said before, it's a way to understand how race and racism affects institutional discourse and educational practices, and it allows us for the recognition of inequities that Puerto Rican and Chicano families experience and offers solutions to overcome injustices. Chicano feminisms in education. So Chicano feminists have been really vital in higher ed to really talk about how these families bring assets into the context of higher education. And so this allows us to examine the capabilities to survive and adhere in the face of oppression due to an individual's race, class, or gender, and for their successful navigation of a four-year institution. A tool of Chicano feminisms is Pedagogies of the Home. This was created by Dolores Salgado Bernal in 1993. And Pedagogies of the Home allows the unique navigational and cultural mechanisms taught within Puerto Rican and Chicano households that cultivate knowledge and allow them to disrupt the ways in which their culture and traditions may be perceived as inferior. So all of these theories allow me to counteract the deficit perspectives that may be going and have played out. So my methodology, building on Mertens and Cresswell specifically, who came up with the transformative convergent mixed methods, I added a layer of complexity to their model with the transformative. They suggest that a transformative theory needs to be engaged at every stage of the research process in order to reveal some type of knowledge. So this is an article that I came out with this fall, actually, with critical race transformative convergent mixed method in particular. And here we have critical race theory, as I explained earlier, at every stage of the research process. So this specific design has a quantitative aspect, a qualitative aspect, and then you compare and relate the results, and then interpretation of them. So for the first part, I'm going to go over the quantitative to understand the macro understanding. So specifically, I want to know what's going on nationally through a quantitative data set. So critical race theory in particular allows us to ask specific questions. So the data sources that I used, it was through the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, which administers the freshman survey to over 50 million students and at over 1,900 institutions. And so this is the longest running longitudinal study in the US of higher education. So it's a really good place to find data. This specific was the freshman survey, was a pre, and then 4 years later, the college senior survey in 2012. So and it measures the student coming in and then 4 years later after. The specific sample was made up of 12,345 students, match sample meaning that it was the same students that took it at the beginning and took it at the end. So with that 12,345, I'm thinking, oh, this is a great sample size. We can do a lot. We can do a lot of inferential stats and be great. However, when I was thinking about being and applying a critical race lens, I have to disaggregate that, right? So what's actually in the sample? And what I found was that Chicano and Mexican Americans, there was an N of 459, which is kind of low, given that we have a 12,000 sample size, right? And then Puerto Ricans was even lower, it's an N of 123. So how representative is this sample? So I was like, I'm going to cross-list this with IPEDS, and IPEDS is institutional data about enrollment and graduation. And so I found when I did that 66% of the match sample came from 15 institutions, and 14 of the 15 were four-year private liberal arts colleges. So what does that say about Latinx students in this context? We know that Puerto Rican and Mexican students and Chicano students tend to go to two-year or four-year public institutions and community colleges and for-profit. So this sample can tell us something, but it may not tell us the whole story. And having been a researcher and having the lens that I do, I chose not to conduct an inferential stats test. However, I did do descriptives, and I wanted to know the independent variable parent level of education and the dependent variable of student aspirations. So I wanted to see, depending on the student's parent level of education, how far did they aspire to go in the educational process. And I did cross tabulations to capture the rate of change. So here we have the percent change in scores for student aspirations for PhD, MD, JD by mother's level of education. We can see that Puerto Rican and Chicano students with mothers with a bachelor's or above, overall there was a decline in their aspirations for students that aspire to attain a post-baccalaureate education. We don't know why, but I think the other half of the presentation of kind of we can give hints to why. But it's startling, right? Because at the very beginning we talked about, yes, if you get a bachelor's degree, your child wants to get that and then go higher. So what's happening in the college environment? We're looking at fathers. We kind of see similar that for Puerto Rican and Chicano students with fathers with a bachelor's or above, overall there was a decline in aspirations. So conclusion, numbers don't speak for themselves. It has to be more complex than that, right? And this is a mural from Venice Beach. It was painted by, I think, Banks, and it's just a representative. A lot of Chicanos will go to this mural and take pictures. So I wanted to shout that numbers don't always speak for themselves. Back to the critical race transformative convergent mixed methods. So if we can't learn a lot from the quant, but we did learn a lot, we have to talk to people. And so this is where we get the qualitative understanding and the micro understanding of why this could be occurring. And I want to make it clear that this is not a sample from the quantitative data set because it was secondary data and I couldn't trace those participants. So this is a subsample, a different subsample. So for this in particular, I use Chicano feminisms to inform educational oral histories, and Chicano feminists have been really central in recovering history and really moving away around like who are the conquerors rather than the losers in the history books. And so they allow us to reveal alternative knowledges to become visible and documented for future generations. And I chose educational histories because oral histories are big and they can go for a really long time. So the participants from the study were focused on their educational experiences. So So the participants within this study self-identified as Chicano O and or Puerto Rican. They were already college educated, so they had already went to a four-year institution or above and received a college degree in the U.S. At least one of their parents attained a bachelor's degree in the U.S. I restricted to the U.S. because I wanted to understand how these populations were experiencing higher education in this context. You can have a parent that's educated in Mexico or Puerto Rico, but that experience is going to be a lot different than here on the U.S. So I targeted New York, Illinois, and California. These three places specifically because they have the highest proportions of both Mexican American and Puerto Rican, and so it just made sense to recruit through those spaces. So the data collection process, I did 60 to 120 minute semi-structured interviews, observational protocol. So I had descriptive notes and reflective notes. So when I went to go interview, I wrote a lot of notes, and then after I reflected on that process and kind of hearing things that I may have not jotted down, and just did reflections. I digitally recorded all of them. The analysis, I transcribed each interview, and I did a first cycle of coding, and to triangulate, I sent back to my participants. And you have to remember these are college educated families, and so there was a lot of dialogue about things I may have not heard, or things that weren't correct, or memories that got boggled, or like, did I really say that? So it was a lot of processes with the families, but it was really great to hear how they were interpreting their stories. So I did a second cycle of coding, triangulated again, and then I finally had to tell them I need to write, so can we please? But they were really great about it, and I did thematic coding based on that. And again, Chicano feminisms with the tool of pedagogies of the home, in which I'll show later. So these are the dyads. I can't go through every single dyad, but if you have questions at the Q&A, please feel free to ask me. But the important thing to note on this is that all of the parents within the Chicano O dyads were mothers and one father. All of the participants were daughters, which is interesting to see that they're all daughters, because that's kind of a reflection of where the pipeline is today. All of the parents were first generation college students, so they were the first in their families to go. And they all went as non-traditional students, meaning that they didn't go straight through. Either they were parents returning to college, or they were transfer students. So they had a different type of process going into four-year institutions. Now, when their kids went to school, they were not qualified as first-generation college students, but they were underrepresented, and that has a different implications of being a student of color on campus. All of them went straight through, so they went straight from high school to four-year institutions as traditional students. Puerto Ricans, similar, we have a little bit more variation with the different father, mother, and son, daughter dyads. Again, something to keep into consideration is that all the Puerto Rican parents were first-generation college students, similar to the Chicano experience, and non-traditional transfer. And again, their children were qualified as underrepresented and traditional. So pedagogies of the home. So Dolores Delgado Bernal in her conceptualization of pedagogies of the home only looked at first-generation Chicana college students, right, and not a variation of them. So here I'm really extending her work and talking about what this means for the next generation and what children of college-educated parents are talking about. So how I'm conceptualizing this is through pláticas y charlas, and again in the Spanish language, pláticas and charlas are informal conversations. So when I went into the houses, we were having these informal conversations and really engaging in what is rich data collection, but may not be seen as rich data collection because it's finding someone to look at the data. But what I found for Chicano O participants is that they were talking about relearning and reclaiming of language. So all of the daughters within the study had lost the Spanish language. And so this had happened because their parents went to schools in which Americanization programs were launched, and we know about Americanization programs with the stripping of any type of culture that was not American, and that happened a lot with the parents, depending where they grew up. And so the children had that history and were told throughout their lives that they had that history. So they made it an active way of life when they got to college to learn the Spanish language. Some of them enrolling in Spanish 101 with no knowledge or studying abroad to understand the language, but also reporting on the history of that stripping of the language. Ownership of privilege refers to these students or children as well as having a college-educated parent, but complicating that with the knowledge that they were still students of color and that not all institutions really recognize that, and so they kind of were in this limbo stage of where do I go for resources, because I don't qualify as first generation, but I'm definitely underrepresented, and there's not a lot of me here or present. Acts of departure, so all of the Chicanas in this specific sample were allowed to leave home and did so. And I think that's contrary to what we know in the literature right now. A lot of the literature talks about Latino first generation college students not being able to leave their family, or it's complicated, more complicated than that. And here, that you wouldn't really see that struggle. So it's a huge contribution. Rendering a collective commitment to communities. So all of the parents within the sample were either social workers or educators, and then their daughters became either educators or so forth, right? A lot of their daughters were professors or postdocs. So they felt an active need to contribute to their community, and were definitely doing activism within the community through education circles. So for the Puerto Ricans, we have sin pelos en la lengua. So basically what that means is no hairs on the tongue, translation, or I don't have a filter and I'm gonna be blunt. And a lot of the Puerto Rican parents taught their children how to be active and talk and be very, like, there's no respectability politics, but you're gonna have respect, but you can assert an authority figure, and that's okay. And so all of them talked about, if I need something, I'm gonna go out and get it, which I think is very East Coast. And so hearing this in the interviews, I'm like, oh yeah, my mom taught me that too. Ownership of privileges, again, similar to Chicano O's, it talks about the ways in which it means to be a non-first generation college student and still underrepresented, either as a male of color or a woman of color in the specific sample. Lucha as a form of activism. This is really important, especially right now, because it talks about, the children talked about the ongoing colonialism that Puerto Rico has with the U.S. And given that everything that's happening with the island, we're going to see an influx, and already have, of Puerto Rican students here. And there's more Puerto Ricans here on the mainland than there is on the island. So we have this back and forth going on. And so they were very aware of that and very active in kind of disrupting that colonial relationship. And again, commitment to communities. So there's this saying in the Puerto Rican student movement in the 1960s, similar to Chicano student movement. Tengo mi Puerto Rico en mi corazón, so I have Puerto Rico in my heart. And all of them had parents that were talking about having the island with them at some point. And there's a frog on the island, it's called the coquin. It goes coquin, coquin. And that was like a thing that brought them here, and they remembered that presence. And so they talked about that commitment to their communities, not just within the U.S., but within the island. So I'm going to show two findings, ownership or privileges, and we can kind of see how they're same but different, and kind of speak back to the quant of why there may be barriers of them not wanting to aspire past a post-baccalaureate degree. So the Rios Dyad, a little bit about them. They're from Texas. They chose to be interviewed together. I went to their home. They sat me down. They're like, sit down. I was part of the family. It was a mother-daughter, and then the daughter had her daughter there, and so it was really cool generational type of setting to be in. And they fed me, and then I hit the recorder, and it went from there. And throughout the, you'll see throughout the dynamics. So, did you get that? I'm like, got it. Elisa, so she's talking about applying to grad school. And Elisa says, I started asking a leading K-12 scholar about PhD programs. After an hour of that conversation, I decided to apply. I did not ask anyone for help. One thing I should mention is that her mother had a master's degree in teaching, and her father was actually a PhD, but he was a white immigrant from Ireland, and so we'll kind of see how that unfolds. Tina, no, you did not, affirming that she did not ask anyone for help. I applied to PhD programs the total wrong way. I did not contact any professors, I just applied. I did not have any idea what you were supposed to do. Tina, she would not listen to me or her dad. Elisa, in my mind, nobody gave me any advice. And I am not saying that you did not, looking at her mom, but I did not hear it. I got into Temple and it was not warm. I got waitlisted at UCLA. Now, Tina says, this is one thing I did not know. I did not know you had been waitlisted at UCLA. You never shared that with me and Dad. So this is like probably a good 20 years later, and this new knowledge is coming to the forefront. Lisa, oh, it's not that I was hiding it. If my dad explicitly told me that and then Tina cuts her off. Your dad has explicitly told you many things because I have been the witness. Elisa, I do not think he explicitly told me. I just want to say that. And then Elisa says this. if our parents have these degrees, there's still so much that we do not know, and it changes. My dad is very different because he's a white man. Now that I'm an assistant professor on tenure track, I will ask him for advice. I ask him a lot about navigating relationships with colleagues, and he's very good at helping me. We have different career goals. I'm a woman of color, it's just different, right? So we see the kind of nuances that happen. It's not that she didn't aspire, it's kind of the barriers of getting the information, and maybe her parents not feeling, they felt like they had a lot to share, but she wasn't ready to receive it, or just that conflict. I mean, it's really nuanced in what we know. I had another example, but it seems to be not here. Okay, well, I'm going to continue. I'm sorry I don't have the Puerto Rican example. I don't know where it went. But the Puerto Rican example, basically, I'll just talk about it for a sec. It was about a mother and son, and they're talking about her engaging in an access program called Espira, which is a K-12 access program for Puerto Ricans. And she unearthed within that interview to her son, and they interviewed separately, and after I interviewed them both, they started talking within the household about what they were experiencing or what had experienced. And he never knew that she was a part of that program, and he actually was conducting his dissertation on that program. And so they kind of had this argument about, why didn't you tell me, Mom? Why didn't you tell me? And she's like, oh, I thought it wasn't a big deal. And he's like, you know I'm Mr. Puerto Rican Studies, and you know I'm doing my dissertation on this. What do you mean it's not a big deal? And so he sent me an email after, which was really great, and he said, basically me and my mom conclude that one generation is not enough. And so it's really a timing that we're doing this work, because we need to get these stories out. So that's kind of the gist of it. I apologize for not having it. I don't know where it went. But so the implications of this work and future research to come. So policymakers really need to talk about terminology in terms of how we're classifying students that are non-first generation, and then how are these students being perceived based on different racial and ethnic experiences. Programming, similar, they had a lot of issues going into institutions of higher ed not being able to participate in programs like EOP because they were geared towards first generation college students. I would say a program that is really kind of allowing these students to participate is around the McNair program, in which I'm a recipient of, right? Because it's first generation, low income, and or underrepresented, and that and or is really important. I would have not been able to engage if I did not have the and or, because my dad's college educated. And it really worked, and I'm not sure I would have went to grad school. And a lot of the participants within the study were also McNair students, and I think that contributes to why they were able to go to grad school and persist through. Financial aid, and we know financial aid varies by state and by different programs and different parent level of ed, and so a lot of them talked about having barriers to get financial aid because their parents were, one of their parents was college educated. So some of them talked about getting into the Ivy League but not having enough money to go, and so having to stay at the local state school. Scholars in particular, I feel like we, especially within higher ed, are moving towards the disaggregation of Latinx and really capturing the nuances of what it means to be within group differences, and it's really important to have those stories heard. Critical theories, guiding methods. So if I was to reanalyze this data using an intersectionality frame, it's going to look a lot different, and different stories are going to come to the forefront, and I think that's really important that we do that with data. Latinx students that attend varying institutional types. So a person in the Ivy League is going to have a very different experience than a student at the two-year community college. They're going to have different barriers, different ways of success, and I think those need to be compared and talked to. For practitioners, specifically training that is culturally appropriate and responsive, and that they have these skills going in when either advising students to know what to do with them. Enrollment management, so how is the registrar's office really examining who and how they accept students, and what does admissions look like in particular? And then student services tend to really call for the need for students that are underrepresented. Sometimes multicultural centers are available and so forth, and we know that they tend to work for students that are underrepresented. So, oh, that's where the fighting went. Oh. Well, back to future research. That's where it went. Sorry about the misplacement. So my future research is really focusing on Hispanic serving institutions by federal law. So a Hispanic serving institution has 25% enrollment or higher and is federally allotted funds. So I'm really interested in those that are Research 1 institutions. And out of 243 HSIs, only 9 are research intensive, which is alarming, right? The majority of them are community colleges or teaching institutions. So right now I'm working with a graduate student at Penn, and we have a report coming out talking about these 9 R1s and what they're doing with their federal grants and if it was what they initially set out to do. So we're doing that through the Penn Minority Serving Institution Center at Penn. Specifically, I've also been collaborating with a colleague at UC Santa Barbara, which is a newly designated R1, and there we conducted a study looking at how undergraduates are perceiving what it means to have this new HSI status. And what we revealed from one article that's coming in the Journal of Latinos in Education is that Latinx undergrad students at this specific institution are going to graduate students for mentoring. And the graduate students that are giving their mentoring are seen as invisible labor. And so they're really kind of trying to complicate, well, can we get credit or can we do something, get some kind of funding for giving this mentoring, because it is invisible labor and it's helping the institution. So we have more studies conducting with that, and in particular we're interested in conducting a one-year comparative ethnography in California and Illinois to get the variation of Latinx experiences and also the different types of R1s and what they're doing. And then Ivy League institutions, so we have the inception of Harvard in 1636 and kind of what they call legacy admissions. And legacy admissions are when you're considered a legacy when the applicant's immediate family attends or has attended that college. And we know very little about the Latinx experience within Ivy Leagues and kind of examining the admissions advantages of being a legacy or not. Are they legacies? If so, how are they experiencing that? And are they first gen? How are they qualified? And then their perceptions of the ascribed terminology on them as a legacy or first generation or student of color. And finally, Rutgers. Woo, we're here. So Jersey has a really great, interesting population to examine. Within Jersey itself, Puerto Rican is at 26.7%, Dominican 21.3%, and Mexican 13.6%. Particularly at Rutgers, the Latinx community is 12.3, both undergrad and graduate students. So I'm interested to see if those overall state populations are representative within the undergrad and grad experience, and really bringing those stories to the forefront. You know, if coming to Rutgers, I definitely would integrate what I know and kind of probably shift my research agenda to address the issues here at the institution and kind of see what's working for students and how we can get more students here. Some interesting collaborations that I feel like could happen is the Rutgers Institute for Improving Student Achievement. So really the professional development of leaders within the community and how I could act as a guiding lens or tool and offer my skills for that, as well as gain skills about the surrounding environment that I would be working under. The Center for Race and Ethnicity here at Rutgers is really important. I feel like the work that I do really centers around what their mission is about. And then again, the Women and Gender Studies Department is really well known across the nation here, very strong. I engage a lot with feminist perspectives and feel like I can actively contribute there, as well as the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies. They really have a lot to do with the Puerto Rican student movement and kind of revealing that now. And last I think fall, they had a Puerto Rican Studies movement panel here, and the Puerto Rican Studies Association that I'm part with is going to be hosted at Rutgers, and they'll be here in the fall. So, any questions? Thank you for having me here today.
I want to thank you very much for your presentation and sharing your research and your insights with us. It was fascinating. Are there questions for Professor Garcia?
Yes.
Nichole, you mentioned earlier in your talk that at least from the parental side, many of the parents that you were working with in your dyads were social workers or in the social sciences. I wanted to ask more probing about your larger sample population. Was it largely a dyad type of symmetry in which most of the students, the children themselves, those who were going into undergraduate and graduate school, also interested in social sciences as a group of disciplines versus going into physical, mathematical, or engineering? Did you begin to probe down and get more granular in terms of disciplinary areas?
Yeah, I have their disciplines, and I think they were a product of their environment because they were all educators. And the one participant that had a mother that was a psychologist, he was in sociology. So they were similar in terms of career. But the children that had college-educated parents, they had kids And so they were really active in making sure that their kids were in the STEM and sciences. And so I'm really working with a family right now where they have twin daughters and they're up for applications to go to college. And they're all engineering intensive. So they're hoping that by the third gen of college educated that they're starting to look into the sciences and really be active in that. And they were able to make those interventions early on. So they got their daughters into early camps with science intensive stuff. So I think you'll see that throughout. Yeah.
My question was, you showed us the data that showed there was a decline in aspirations for educational achievement. The parents' completion of post-bac, was that what you would say is a traditional directly from undergrad to master's, PhD, or did they go back later in life and the students saw the graduate student experience? I speak because I have a 13-year-old and she's like, I'm never going to be a graduate student. And I just wondered if you thought that had an impact.
Most definitely. I think for the quant data, it's kind of hard to speak to that, right? Because we don't know where the parents actually got their degree because it's not an item on there. But for the qual data, yeah, so some of them did see their parents go to grad school and they were fine with it. And then one of them did, and it kind of similar experience. Like, well, that seems pretty hard. I'm not sure I want to do it. But it was more of like making sure that their kid was involved. So the mother always took the student with her to school and made sure that she knew what professors were. So they had a deeper understanding of what the college environment looked like. And so I think they were more apt to do that. But yeah, it was definitely an experience with the student or not. It was a variation.
So Lisa reminded me that I've been amiss. I would like the questioners to identify themselves. I think that would help Professor Garcia understand.
Great question.
I'm Jerry Cukor, Dean of Graduate School.
Roberta Hunter, I'm a candidate in the LSID program.
I'm
Yeah.
Dan. So I'm wondering, kind of going back between the qualitative data and the quantitative data, it sounded like that quantitative data set was fairly limited if you look at kind of pre-post.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, why do you think that is, given that data set, if you have some thoughts on that? And also, if you looked at the pre to see if there were any issues about the incoming class that was of particular interest. I don't know.
Yeah. So Harry itself, higher education research institute. So when you apply for the data there in particular, it costs money. Because I was a student there, I got it for free. It's also a fee-based survey, so it's really expensive to do the pre and post as an institution, so that kind of speaks to it. They also only measure the 4-year experience, so like the student has to get out in 4 years. We know that Latino students usually take longer than that, and they don't account for transfer either. And so they're really aware of that, and so that's why I think it was limited. I think they're trying to redo the survey in a way that it can speak to those experiences. And actually, I didn't get the whole freshman survey because I could only get the match sample when I was applying. So, I mean, there's limitations within secondary data, and I think that's kind of what the article that I pushed forward is, okay, how do we work around those limitations, but also give strength to the survey itself, because Harry was actually the first, before the census, to really break down Chicano, Mexican American, and Puerto Rican. And I think it was because the ASTMs at the time understood what was happening on the national higher education level. And so we see that emerge first, but it's complicated, unless I'm incorrect.
No, I was just thinking that here at Rutgers, and it's curiosity, I don't know why, but they differentiate between Puerto Rican Hispanic and then all other Hispanics.
Oh yeah, see.
So it is, and I haven't seen that before, so I mean, for the work that you're doing, that's great. But that seems to be a consistent thing. Instead of just lumping all Latino students into one group, they have Puerto Rican and then everybody else. And that's, I don't know how long they have been doing that. And I don't know why. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting that Rutgers has that kind of, but they don't disaggregate beyond Puerto Rican. So
geographical location matters.
Sorry. Okay, so, but I did have a question though. I was really interested because I think in my own research, I have come to recognizing my assumption that when you're doing research about Latino students, it almost comes in with the assumption that they're pretty much all first generation students. Right, and so when you get anybody that's a non-first generation student, you kind of put that as an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
And so when you actually meet somebody who says, you know, my parents aren't college educated, you're like, oh, I didn't think about that. That's interesting. You're an anomaly. So the fact that you did this research, I think, is really interesting. But I guess I'm curious to hear if there's other research sources that you have been able to tap into, because I'm thinking about all the research that I have looked at, and I don't think I'm the only one that kind of comes in with that assumption that we're talking about Latino students, you immediately jump to the positioning of them being first generation, blah, 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 blah. Right, so I guess I'm just curious if there's other people doing this kind of work, or if you are drawing from other sources to inform this way that you're looking at this population.
Great question. It took me a while to sell it to my own chair, because he was like, I don't understand. What do you mean you're looking? Because like, again, the assumption of immigration status to U.S. citizenship status kept coming up. He's like, so we already know a lot in sociology about what it means to be a first generation, and like not in the context of immigration. And so he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, college educated. I don't care about the immigration status. So essentially there was no literature. It was more about, you know, like the ways I outlined the traditional college student. It was more that, and not so much focusing on race and ethnicity. So I am filling a huge gap that hasn't been examined yet, and I think that being in student groups, a lot of the students talking about having college educated parents, they were in first gen groups, and they would never tell anyone that they had college educated parents. So it's this type of shame. And so having to unlearn that has been really interesting, right? Because I would say in Asian or white families, it's a point of pride and a point of legacy, right? Especially in Ivy Leagues, like, oh, I had my father do this, do that. And for them, it wasn't. It was like, nope, I don't want to talk about it. And for me in particular, my dad's college educated. He was actually the director of the Center of Student Ethnic Affairs when I was an undergrad there, and I never told anyone who my dad was. And that's kind of crazy, right, when you're thinking about navigating a space. But they shared similar experiences. So it's kind of how do we make sure that those assets are really live and living in our communities, because we've been here for a while and we definitely have those successes that we need.
Roberto for your Nichole Garcia in the higher ed program. In looking at the theoretical frameworks that you use, and you talked a lot about the participants as kind of holding knowledge, right? And so in triangulating data, did you see how that impacted the participants if they came to know themselves as knowledge producers, in terms of how they responded to themes that maybe showed up for them?
Oh yeah. Actually, I'm going to say this. So a lot of them became academics, and a lot of the articles that I'm producing now are in collaboration with them. And so it's been really fascinating to talk with them about how they perceived what they experienced, but also I think having shown the results to them as well, their findings, that they're not alone. And so that was really interesting to say, okay, now we can finally come forward and not be shamed and talk about these experiences. So yeah, I mean, a lot of them were somewhat familiar with the theoretical frameworks I was using, and they're like, are you sure that's right? Or when it came to the Spanish language, that was a really big point of contention that they wanted to discuss, because Gloria Anzaldúa talks about it. And she has a quote in there that if you don't have your native language, then you don't have your culture. And a lot of them said, no, that's not true. Like, we have our culture and we're proud of it. And so they wanted that to come out a lot too with the Chicana and Chicana Central. So yeah, it was really interesting and informative. And like I said, a lot of them become academics and collaborators, and they see them at conferences. And actually the woman that I'm collaborating with at UC Santa Barbara, she was a participant in the study. We came out with an article, was an R&R right now in AERJ, on the relationships with Chicana fathers and the Chicana daughters, and we interviewed our fathers, and we have a conversation in that manuscript with them, and what we learned from them.
Alisa Belzer, I'm in Learning and Teaching. I have actually two questions. One, and they're related. On the issue of sort of second generation college students from immigrant parents, I was wondering, you said there's no literature on Latinx students, but have you, and I realize it's not exactly parallel, but what about European Americans, Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, you know, who came 20th century from very uneducated European families? Is there any research on that about sort of what happens cross-generationally?
Yeah, through immigrant to U.S. Yeah, actually in sociology. So Vilma Ortiz and Edward Diaz have a book out that they did. It was a big study, a longitudinal study where they compared white immigrants and Mexican American immigrants and kind of talking about that experience. And they found similar things in regards to the first and second generation who really had high aspirations and attained, and then by the third and fourth there's a decline, right? And that may be attributed to the educational system here or other factors in terms of neighborhoods they lived in. So yeah, there is work, and Tomas Jimenez at Stanford also has a follow-up to that book. It's called Replenished Ethnicities. And so they're kind of talking about the socialization and around race, but also around ethnicity, and they're two separate things. But yeah, it does exist. I haven't seen it so much. It's trickling, I think, in higher ed literature, but I don't think we cross as much as we could.
It seems like there's
a lot of parallels.
Yeah, and also a lot that could, because there's such a long history of immigration
Exactly.
and education.
Yeah.
And my second question is related to the second generation versus first generation issue. There's a lot of, obviously, research on what the challenges are of being first generation. And I wonder if really looking at these second generation students has challenged any assumptions, either affirming or disconfirming, that we have of that first generation, and why the challenges are that they have. If you see them playing out in different ways, but still there for second generation, if that changes anything about how we understand the first generation experience.
Yeah, that's a good, so a pilot study that came out of this, I did with some colleagues at LA. We wanted to understand what that generational status looked like at an HSI. And so we did it at an HSI that was a teaching institution, Cal State LA, obviously. And what we found within that study is that regardless of first gen or second gen status, they were experiencing the university the same. And that the resources, they felt like they couldn't get financial aid, they felt like their college counselors were not responsive to what they needed, and they didn't have like the resources, right, to really pursue. And so that was alarming to find, and again, it may be the institutional context or just, I'm not sure, right? And it was only one study at one specific institution, so I think we could learn a lot, and I hope that my future research can really expand what we know and then also take it to other groups. So I'd really love to do a comparative study with African American families, because they have long-standing histories here, and kind of see the similarities and differences and the barriers. But it seems that race and racism definitely permeates the educational institution, and there's programs and stuff that can help, but the institution needs to change to meet these students' needs, and the demographics are changing too. So
It would give you a much more systemic understanding rather than a deficit understanding.
Exactly.
To show that the second generation, even parents who have the social capital, there's still
something's not translating. Yeah.
Just to follow up to the point that Lisa brought up, you mentioned this earlier in your talk about financial aid, and you said that students were interested, particularly in applying to graduate school, were worried about whether they even be eligible for federal financial aid. But what about the issue related to institutional support, fellowships, teaching assistantships, the things that graduate programs or graduate schools can provide? UC Santa Barbara has resources that provide the students coming into their graduate programs that are independent of federal financial aid. Is that even within the knowledge set of the students?
Yeah, I would say they had that knowledge base. Two, which was interesting out of the Puerto Rican sample, two of them got their master's in TFA. And that was a way in which they thought about grad school, one, and two, actually pursued it and had that partnership with TFA. So that was interesting. And then the other ones definitely had assistantships, and we're aware of that as well. Yeah.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Garcia. My question, one's a comment, and listening to you talk about some of the findings around first generation, second generation, reminds me of some of Oswald's work.
Oh, yeah.
Around Shaker Heights, and some of the very same kinds of parallels were drawn between low income and more middle class African Americans. So, but my larger question is around, when you think about the implications of your findings and what institutions of higher education can do to better meet the needs of students of color in general, but certainly Puerto Rican and other Latinx students in particular, what are some of the implications you see?
That's a great question, right? I think I'm still thinking through this, especially as a junior scholar and coming into this work, and how to get funding to support this work, right? And research grants and why it's important. But I would say that in conversations with Kellogg, because part of my part of my postdoc is working on disaggregating data, and I feel like the more we can do that in the quant realm to support the evidence of like, oh, these educational attainment based on parent level education and race and ethnicity, we're seeing this decline happen. The more we can show that quantitatively will allow us to ask for funds to help initiatives bring in, like, so for Puerto Ricans in particular, I think we were talking about this last night, like Puerto Rican experiences are different than Mexican American experiences, and having separate groups to acknowledge that and being able to work within is something that needs to happen. So I think the go-to is programs and initiatives that support those students. That would be my answer, but I think the bigger answer is like, how do we get funding to help this research come to the forefront? And I think that's my biggest challenge right now, is really how do I think through that and make sure that it's selling. And that's probably why I did the quant stuff, so I could have the numbers and do it in a very responsible, culturally relevant way.
I have a two-part question around the notion of deficit discourses. Can you elaborate and enlarge on how that notion intersects with your findings a little bit more?
Yeah.
And then the second thing is thinking about your role as an instructor and encountering students and others in the community who are perhaps unintentionally working with deficit models. How do you address that, and how do you help? How do you work as a teacher to, I guess, disrupt that and help students come to an understanding?
Okay. So the first part about deficit discourses, you kind of see this movement through the eugenics movement, saying science-based evidence saying that communities of color are inferior because the shape of their skull, biological, right? So within my actual research, the dissertation, I kind of traced that discourse historically around how communities of color have been framed. And we come to learn through the sociology that that necessarily wasn't true, right? And we see this shift in how culture is examined, and not so much as something that's inferior, but what happens, because we have evidence that scholars, regardless of that eugenics movement being inferior, were producing knowledge. Like W. Du Bois is a perfect example of having knowledge and producing books and, going to Penn and not being recognized for his contributions. So when I talk about deficit ways, I think it's stirring around race, not being biological, but as socially constructed, and that families have gotten kind of pushed into that biological inferiority, like they have nothing to contribute. And so that's something that we're counteracting with this work in particular. And within Chicano feminism and pedagogies of the home, like there's teachings and strategies that are happening that are just not making it into the academic circles as they should, but they've been here, right? And now we're publishing on it. The second part of your question about my pedagogy, so I think teaching at Penn has allowed me to work with practitioners a lot, and also through my mentoring. And I have to realize that as a scholar who's been doing this research for a really long time, that not everyone has the same competency as I do. And I think it works around patience. So one pedagogical tool that I use is name narratives, and it comes out of New Mexico. Margaret Montoya, she's a critical race legal scholar, and she talks about everyone has a name, and that's where we can start to understand our humanity within one another. And so anytime I teach a course, I assign them name narratives, and they have to tell me where they got their name, the whole name, if they like their name, and how they developed their name through their identity, right? And you'll see that within sharing that in the class, it definitely breaks down a lot of barriers and talks about the points in which struggles and the points in which are not struggles, the beauty within it. And that really seems to help in my pedagogy, especially talking around that. It's always seemed to work really well. I don't know if we have one quick one.
Okay. Hi, my name is Joshua Phillips. I'm the second year in the College Student Affairs program. So, given that your research, how would you contribute to our education of College Student Affairs most of us are practitioner track. And so how would your research contribute to the understanding of how we can be better practitioners within our field?
Yeah, I think when you teach practitioners in particular, you all are doing the groundwork. So it's great to be here in research and theory, but unless you implement it and see how it's running on the ground, then we really don't understand. So I think an approach that I use within the classroom itself is that my students are co-creators of knowledge. And so when you come in, I want to know your experience and things that you see as strengths and not, and how we can have evidence-based research support that. And so depending on the demographic context that we're working in and where you're working at, whether it's community college or a four-year, that's something that I hold an asset within the classroom to meet the students' needs of where we're trying to learn, right? And I think within my syllabus is always changing, and so if there's something that you don't see in it, I want to know about it so I can add it and really talk about it and really explore it. So I feel like that's where I would contribute.
If you have other questions for Professor Garcia, she's with us all day.
Yes.
And please reach out and get to know her better and help her get to know us better during the day. Right now, though, is a well-deserved break.
Great.